So, by way of a short introduction, Graham McCulloch, Dr. Graham McCulloch, sorry, is an ecologist who has spent the past 30 years in Botswana conducting research and working in the environment and conservation sector. After 4 years working as a professional guide in one of Botswana's premier safari camps, he completed a PhD to understand the ecology of the wetlands of the Makadikadi salt pans in 2003. Graham then followed a career as an ecological consultant, contributing to various community area and protected area management plans, biodiversity assessments, and EIAs until he co-founded an NGO called Eco-Exist Trust. Several years on, and the project has achieved many big milestones, finding ways to reduce conflict and address some of the key drivers that cause negative interactions between elephants and people. So I'm going to leave it at that and let Graham introduce himself and the work that he does, and to give us a talk which he's titled "Balancing Elephants, Development and Climate Change." Thanks, Graham. Very exciting, and the floor is all yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Kirsten, for that intro. Good morning, everyone. I will keep my intro very brief, just to follow on from Kirsten's intro there. Like Kirsten said, I am one of the co-directors of the Eco-Exist Trust, which is an NGO that's focused on reducing conflict between people and elephants around the Okavango Delta and finding solutions to make it easier for people to live with elephants, which is a huge a huge ask, and I think one that many people ask us, how do we go about doing that? So I'm gonna touch on some of those issues, and really focus on one of the underlying drivers of what is driving heightened competition between people and elephants, and how can we resolve or find a solution to this driver of conflict. But my talk this morning, Balancing Elephants, Development and Climate Change, is really sort of encapsulates a couple of key themes. One of them is, touching on the elephant population itself in Botswana. What is that? Where do we stand in terms of numbers of elephants in Botswana today? How do we come about those figures? And then what that means in terms of how increased development and climate change, how that is impacting our relationship with elephants, and specifically in terms of driving heightened conflict between people and elephants in these hotspot areas around northern Botswana, where high concentrations of elephants share landscapes with many rural communities. And the Okavango Delta Panhandle is one of those hotspot areas. So our mission as Eco-Exist is to support the lives and livelihoods of people who live with elephants while considering the needs of elephants. So what is the situation in terms of elephant populations in Botswana? And when we ask that question, we really need to couch the status of the elephant population in Botswana in terms of how it relates and how it is part of a wider population that moves between within and between a larger landscape that is called the Kaza Transfrontier Conservation Area. I'm sure some of you have heard of that. Kaza, the Kavango Zambezi Transfrontier Conservation Area, is made up of many different protected areas, shown here on this map, which spans 5 different countries: northern Botswana, northeastern Namibia, southeastern Angola, southwestern Zambia, and part of Zimbabwe to the east there. And so this is a map of the Kaza Transfrontier area. showing the borders between the various different countries. And this map depicts the most recent population survey results from a CASA-wide elephant survey, which was conducted in 2022. So this is the most recent estimate of the population of elephants around CASA. And as you can see, Botswana, which is the southernmost polygon in this conservation area, in this map, hosts the largest population of elephants. And I'll go through the figures just now, but I just wanted to flag, I wonder what you thought looking at this population distribution. So the blue dots and the blue concentrations basically depict where all of the elephants occurred during this elephant census. Now, I have to say that this census was conducted in the middle of the dry season. So you can see that there is a big concentration of elephants in certain areas, particularly this area in the northwestern section of Botswana, which is the Okavango Delta. You can pretty much see that elephant distribution defines the extent of the permanent swamps of the Okavango Delta in the northwestern corner of Botswana there. To the west is Kaudum National Park, where permanent water is pumped in the park, and those concentrations of elephants basically are concentrated around those permanent waterholes. To the east, in Zimbabwe, that really high concentration of elephants there in that blue clump, that is Hwangi National Park. And again, those elephants are concentrated around quite a number of permanent artificial water points that are pumped throughout the year, which sustains those elephants throughout the dry season. So we're pretty much looking at a total population of about just under 230,000 elephants in CASA. It's half the population of elephants in Africa, and Botswana hosts half of that CASA population, about 130,000 elephants that move among protected areas in northern Botswana and across borders between protected areas and areas outside of protected areas, between Namibia, Angola, Zimbabwe, and Zambia. So this gives you a really, really good sort of snapshot of the extent of the elephant population. What does that mean? That means that, the population in Botswana is not confined to Botswana. It does move back and forth, and this is really important in terms of how we manage that population. For example, in a year like this with heightened drought, that population needs to access critical resources like water. And like you see here, the elephants do concentrate around wetlands, permanent wetlands, whether it be the swamps of the Okavango, the Chobe River there, or artificial water points in Hwangi or Kaudum, for example. And that really means that there is a need for elephants to move around in order to alleviate pressure in areas where there's really high concentrations to access resources elsewhere. I would say that before I move on, that this distribution looks quite different during the wet season. Elephants move away from permanent wetlands, and the data that we have collated from lots of different colors shows a huge distribution across the entire area of this CASA landscape. This is a map then of a collation of data collected from just under 230 GPS collars that were placed on elephants from 9 different organizations who have come together under a working group for CASA, the elephant sub-working group. This committee basically has agreed to share all of their data to look at how does this population move around within countries and between countries. And these green areas are a representation of the concentration of movements in this area from these 230 colored elephants. And you can see much of the concentration of movement is really occurring between Hwangi in the east and northeastern Botswana. Again, further north up into the Chobe area, and this area here, the Kwando wildlife dispersal area up in the Linyanti, and the area where we work in, has got the largest concentration of movement across borders. This is a major movement pathway whereby elephants from northern Botswana move into Namibia and up into Angola and Zambia. And so this is a hugely important corridor for elephant movement, you know, at various times during the year, according to seasons. There's some really heightened, consistent movement patterns that are really the dark green areas, these little green pathways. You'll see some in Cowdom around the water holes. These water holes are defined by these dark green areas where there's a lot of movement to and from the water holes. But similarly here in the panhandle of the Okavango Delta, on the eastern side of that panhandle, you'll see very well defined pathways. These are from information that we as EcoExist have collected over the last 10 years from 50 different collars in the area, really defining the extent and the concentration of movement between different critical resource use areas. So understanding all of this is really critical if we are to really effectively manage populations, but also to find solutions to alleviate conflict. And I'll go into that a little bit further. This is a map of our initial study area, the Eastern Okavango Panhandle. You can see the panhandle area here that runs down like the handle of the frying pan, with villages dotted all the way along the edge. Obviously, people have settled here for generations to be able to access the abundant resources that the panhandle offers. But also those resources are shared with many wildlife that move between the dryland, the woodland resources in NG11 and NG13, just south of the Namibian border here. And those wildlife move between that dry woodland and the Okavango Delta on a frequent basis to access water and other resources in the Delta. And so this movement has to occur between the villages and between development areas. And here lies the overlap in terms of land use, the use of space and resources, and how that leads to heightened competition and negative interactions between people and elephants. This is an aerial view of one of the largest corridors in the area. This large pathway that you can see running through the woodland here is juxtaposed. It's positioned right next to a field area here. You can see there's a couple of watch huts next to this field. As you can imagine, this field has experienced a lot of conflict with elephants. Literally hundreds of elephants pass along this corridor every day during the dry season, and that starts in earnest before the end of the crop season. So the crops are really sort of a big attraction as elephants are moving from the woodland to the delta every night. So the farmers in this situation face a big challenge to protect their crops. And then what happens if this field is expanded, or if another field is allocated right here on this corridor, unbeknownst to the land boards or the land authority, we would all understand that would put a farmer in that position, having a new field right on this corridor, in a very difficult situation, having to deal with hundreds of elephants every night when they're trying to harvest crops. And here lies one of the underlying drivers of conflict in this area and many other areas where people share space with elephants. So this is one of the drivers that we, through long-term research, identified as the key driver of conflict is the should I say the allocation of fields in areas in critical habitat like these movement corridors without considering the consequences of doing that, or the need for elephants to move between field areas to access critical resources like water. If we continue to convert this habitat into agricultural fields, it's going to really exacerbate the problem. And as climate change increases the pressure on these permanent wetland resources, this movement happens earlier in the season, so way before the crops have matured and can be harvested. So putting additional pressure on farmers trying to survive, trying to grow enough crops to feed their families. This is just a map of all of the conflict hotspots that we've mapped over a 4-year period. The red dots represent fields that have been entered by elephants and the crops have been eaten. The green fields that have been monitored were fields that have somehow avoided that conflict for a number of reasons. And we looked at all the factors that contribute to what contributes a field likelihood to be raided. And from all of the socio-ecological and cultural variables through different modeling, we looked at the impact of a position of a field next to one of these key pathways or corridors of movement of elephants between woodlands and the delta. And mapping those pathways, we identified many different pathways, but some really key ones. The yellow lines here represent key corridors where many elephants move very frequently. The blue lines are infrequently used pathways, but the yellow ones are really key corridors, and that red one there is actually the biggest in the area. And so we looked at the impact of a field's position in relation to these key corridors. And it turns out that if you're positioned within a kilometer of one of these major corridors, you're twice as likely to be raided by elephants during the crop season compared to fields further away. And this turns out to be one of the biggest factors contributing to the likelihood of elephant crop raiding in fields. So we took this information and the evidence that we gathered and all of the statistical evidence. We took this to Tawana Land Board, and in 2015, the Land Board identified the importance of considering these major corridors in land use allocation processes to avoid conflicts, to avoid human-wildlife conflict. And so during a long process through a model, a GIS, which is a Esri Arc GIS. I don't know if some of you have used GIS modeling platforms like Esri or QGIS. Basically, this model, called the Land Use Conflict Identification Strategy, collates lots of different information about land use preferability, including the community's resource needs and resource use areas, policies that drive land use change from different sectors, and various different existing patterns of land use and land cover change. And so this model basically predicts what different land use types are preferred in different zones. So it basically identifies zones that help in the decision-making among the land authorities as to, where the best places for agriculture that are away from village expansion and away from tourism hotspots and away from critical wildlife corridors in order for farmers to avoid conflict with elephants and other wildlife. And so basically, it's trying to achieve a landscape that we can sort of plan using different zones for different land use types. And this we can use as a tool to help inform land allocation decision-making. And in the last 10 years of EcoExist's existence, we've been working with Tawana Land Board and the sub-land boards really to try and help provide as much information and as much geospatial analysis that can help them make decisions on land use planning and land use allocation, really to avoid land use conflicts, which is one of their key challenges. This is a map for the Saronga Sub-Land Board that came out of the LUCIS process, identifying the villages, the village expansion areas, the agricultural zones, the green zones around the villages, specifically identifying those areas with good soils closer to the villages that give farmers the best possible chance of growing crops, but away from these major elephant and other wildlife corridors. Like I said earlier, placing farmers inside these corridors just pitches them against a huge elephant conflict situation that's really difficult to manage. This is a close-up of the image, really identifying preferential zones for different land use types. And so this is now being used as a tool to help with land use decision-making by Tawana Land Board. One of the things that is key is really this process needs, any process like this, land use planning has to be participatory process. It needs to incorporate inputs from the key stakeholders. It needs to be driven from the land authority, from the planning units, DELUPU, and it needs to involve the communities to help verify their perceptions and their knowledge, their expert knowledge about where these key areas for agriculture are, where the key soils are, where they perceive the key wildlife corridors are, and verify those against the information that we've gathered from colors or monitoring of the corridors. So this is a really important part of the whole process. And then defining these corridors really helps bring awareness to where these corridors are. Purely just for starters, just to bring awareness towards the potential danger of walking in these areas and just to be prepared. These corridors have, for example, helped us leverage support for school buses that now take children across these corridors every morning to school. But they also help define these corridors and, for land officials, for technical officers on the ground, for land overseers, to be aware and to consider these corridors during land allocation processes. And these are some of the polygons that can be put on GPSs when you're an officer in the field, just to identify where you are in relation to all of these zones. So these are some of the activities that we've been working with the authorities, just to help them just build tools and knowledge when they're during land allocation processes, assisting using, training using GPSs and how to then transfer that information to maps in the office as a land surveyor, for example. So how then can we further take advantage of this landscape approach to addressing human wildlife coexistence outside of the corridors? Now we have been really working hard with the Department of Crop Production to identify cluster farms, areas that farmers can be protected with one single solar powered electric fence, with areas that are available for future expansion of fields, away from the corridors, to give farmers a much better chance of protecting fields during the crop season and have a much better chance of harvesting at the end of the season. This is an example of some of the maps that the sub-land boards have drawn up. There, wildlife corridors, and the light blue areas are agricultural field zones that can be clustered and have electric fences built around them next to the villages, which are the orangey cream areas. This is on the Western Panhandle. We've expanded this model to the Western Panhandle. This is in the Gumari sub-land board jurisdiction. And we are conducting more of this modeling around the southern end of the Okavango, around Sihitwa and the Man sub-land boards. So yeah, this is an example then of how we can, this bright pink line represents a major elephant corridor. Before we really brought attention to this corridor and identified them and got them recognized in these Lucis maps, this area of fields here to the west of the corridor represents an area in which about 180 farmers conduct arable agricultural farming every year. Their cluster fields, their fence line extended along this red line, and it actually bisected this major elephant corridor. And as we mentioned earlier, this area of the cluster field experienced a really heightened conflict each year with elephants. So farmers on the edge really experienced a lot of conflict every year. And so what we did over a number of years of consultations, the farmers agreed to pull the fence back to this green line. So the fence line now comes along this green area, allowing elephants to move along the corridor. And now this cluster boundary is now surrounded by a solar-powered electric fence, which protects all of these fields from elephant encroachment onto the field area. And by allowing the elephants to move along the corridor, it's made it much easier to manage this fence and to protect the fields. So that's a good example of how we can now use all of this information, all of the different inputs from the various sectors and the various contributions in a collaborative approach to come up with solutions to make it easier for farmers and elephants to coexist. Then we use various different mitigation technologies to deter elephants around these cluster fields. And really, I'll stop there because you know, that really gives you a good idea of some of the solutions to a really important issue that is becoming more and more frequent in spaces, in areas outside of protected areas where many rural communities that depend on subsistence livelihoods find themselves, you know, in a situation pitched against a situation where they are experiencing heightened human-wildlife conflict. And it's a, you know, finding solutions to this. And I might add that over 60% of the area of that population that I showed you earlier, over 60% of the area that is covered by that elephant population occurs outside of protected areas, where they share landscape with communities, with people, and most of those communities rely on subsistence agriculture. So that gives you an idea of the scale of the issue that we're dealing with. But hopefully, what I've shown you today just gives you an idea of how we can go about. I'm not saying that this is the solution, but it is one approach that we have taken, the landscape approach, to really understand what are the needs of people and elephants, and how can we then reconcile them in order to make it easier for them to share the landscape and the resources within that landscape, and come up with solutions to really reduce the conflict that those communities are experiencing. So yeah, I'll stop there, and I'm around for the next 20 minutes, and really happy to answer any questions that you might have. So thanks a lot for attending and for listening to the presentation.
Thank you, Graham. An amazing presentation. I think the research that you're doing is just incredible, and obviously takes a huge amount of energy, and yeah, absolutely fantastic research. So thank you very much for sharing it with us. I'd like to open the floor to our primary audience, the Botswana International University of Science and Technology, the students that we can see in front of us. I'm going to give them first priority in asking questions. Richard, would you facilitate those questions, please?
Thank you. Anyone with who wants to go first? So this is a very interesting and important work, especially that you're working with land authorities. It's a good example of how research can be, you know, can influence things for the better. So there are many cases of human elephant conflicts around that area. So in terms of behavior and conduct around elephants, how much are you doing to capacitate the community there so that they know what to do when they see an elephant, and they, you know, yeah, behave appropriately in the presence of elephants? Thank you.
Yeah, great question, Richard. Thanks a lot. I'll just turn my video off because I think it makes it easier for you to hear me. I think, just while I'm talking. But yeah, great question, Richard. It's really important. So what we have a team, we have an education and awareness team that works full time on developing curriculum for the schools, for the primary and secondary schools in the area, but also for the general public around what we call it safety around elephants, and really just empowering people with the knowledge and understanding of, you know, what elephants are, how they behave in different situations, and what you can do to better avoid negative confrontations, and be safer in a landscape that you share with elephants. You know, and that some of that really comes from, you know, we take it for granted that people who live with elephants really, you know, have grown up with elephants all the time and understood their behavior and know how to behave around them, which is not always the case. And, you know, some of the older generation in particular, during the war, there was very, very few elephants in this area compared to what they are now. So, you know, building their knowledge and understanding, we believe is really important. And also, like I mentioned earlier, bringing ways that make it safer for the most vulnerable, who we identified as children walking to school every morning, sometimes having to walk 3-4 kilometers across these major elephant corridors. And also elderly people trying to get to clinics in the morning, doing the same. And that's why we really came up with this Elephant Express idea, where we now have, you know, the private sector and in natural selection, the operator natural selection, who've invested in 3 of these buses that really assist children in the most affected areas, where most of the elephants move most of the time, to help them just cross those corridors every day back and forth to school. And similarly, the elderly, taking them to clinics and taking nurses to some of the remote clinics. So yeah, so some of these interventions are really key, because this is a chronic stress, if you like, among communities living with elephants and other wildlife, is that there's a constant sort of, in the back of your mind, you always have to think, well, there could be an elephant around the corner, or a lion, or one of these other conflict species. And then that does affect people's perceptions of wildlife, and you know, empowering people with knowledge and providing resources that they can overcome some of these challenges has a huge impact.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, Richard. Have you got any, are there questions from the students?
I think so, yes. Yeah, yes. Thank you.
Super.
My name is Hahope. So my question is, I heard a prof mention that there are more elephants in Botswana compared to the neighboring countries, Zimbabwe, Namibia, and Zambia. I wanted to know what factors contribute to Botswana to have a larger elephant population compared to the neighboring countries, and if there are some significant differences between the habitat quality in the 4 countries and the availability of resources. Thank you.
Another great question. Thank you very much for that. Yes. Yeah, the large population in Botswana is really a testament to Botswana's efforts, conservation efforts, and wildlife management efforts. You know, roughly 40% of the country has been protected inside protected areas, national parks or game reserves, or wildlife management areas, which is a large proportion of the area. And much of those protected areas are around key ecosystems like the Okavango Delta or the Chobe River habitat, or the Makadi, for example. And those are key resource areas, resource ecosystems in which elephants thrive. So, and also, relative to some of the countries, we have a low population in Botswana. So relative to places like Zambia, for example, or Zimbabwe, outside of protected areas, we haven't got as much developed areas that are developed. So much of the area between protected areas is still fairly untouched in terms of, it's still intact habitat where elephants can exist and move between protected areas and actually live in. So, also added to that, the efforts of the Botswana government to control poaching. Poaching is a big driver of elephants' movements in the landscape across borders. During the war in Angola, elephants were driven out. There are other incidences where heightened poaching in periods drove elephants' population numbers down and meant elephants moved into other areas or countries, nearby countries. So overall, it's a real testament to Botswana and to Botswana's ability to conserve these key ecosystems for wildlife. And as a result, the tourism industry has really flourished and contributes a really significant amount to GDP in Botswana now, as a result of the country being able to manage its biodiversity and these key megafauna populations like elephants. So yeah, I hope that answers that question.
Thanks, Graham. Is there a thumbs up for the answer? I think it's good. Yeah, there we go. Richard's thumb comes up. Okay, excellent. I'm going to just move over to Kumo Faku, who's been obviously waiting patiently in the wings. Kumo, do you want to ask your question?
Thank you to the professor. Am I audible? Okay. I don't know if I'm audible, but my question relates to human activity within that area and the land use activities in the area. How did this research actually asked in terms of the role that the elephants play in terms of the cultural importance within that area, and in terms of as well assisting with highlighting the value of the animal in terms of the cultural importance to the people within that area. And the other question would be, what was the role of the public sector in terms of capturing the information and including them in their strategic planning for land use management? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kumo. I found it hard to capture some of that, but I think I grasped it, and I'll try and answer as much as I can. But please let me know if I've missed a point there. The first question was about the cultural value of having elephants and sharing a landscape with elephants, and how that how that is important in managing elephants and human elephant conflict. It is really important factor. People do coexist with elephants there. People are coexisting with elephants on a daily basis. Not all people want elephants removed completely from the habitat, from the area. It would obviously be a lot easier for people to move around feeling safer and grow crops without having elephants raid and eat their crops. But people do recognize the importance of elephants, especially in terms of driving the tourism industry, which employs many of their sons and daughters in the camps in the Delta. But also there's a very important need to then turn the cultural value of elephants, because they do form part of the environment and the habitat that people live in, and people do recognize that. But really, in order to overcome this and to make it easier for them to coexist with elephants, there really needs to be a push towards diversifying the local economy to generate more benefits coming back to households in communities that share landscape with elephants as a direct result of living and coexisting with those elephants. And that's a really important aspect of what we do, is supporting small enterprises, entrepreneurs through different sectors to link opportunities for market-linked benefits to a life with elephants. Some of the low-hanging fruit is, diversifying tourism within the communities, showcasing life with elephants through different activities and performances, cultural performances. Again, bringing out that value of the cultural aspect of, a life living with elephants. And that there's opportunity there. And so we need to find ways to leverage that opportunity to create more benefits that will really tip the cost-benefit imbalance of coexisting with elephants. To your second point, the public sector really, they have been, over the last 10 years, working closely with the public sector, they are very open and willing to look at scientific evidence and demonstration outputs on ways and understanding more how wildlife use the landscape, how they interact with the agricultural sector, for example. And I think very open. Obviously, it takes a long time to gain any sort of to gain persistence in terms of now impacting the decision making and certainly the strategic planning and the land use planning aspects, because that means engaging officials right up the chain at the district level and also at the national level. So it takes a lot of consultations, it takes a lot of working together, building relationships and partnerships. But I would have to say that the public sector have been really open and very good at accommodating. Whether or not that is represented in policy and legislation at the moment is another question. But like I say, that process does take a long time, and it's something that we are working on tirelessly, just to really, we don't have the answers. It's our input as a collaborative partner to help inform the right answers, as a collective. And I would say that's really where we stand.
Thank you, Graham. I see a thumbs up from Kumo, so that's well answered. Thank you very much. There's a question in the chat, which I'd like to get to, by Aicha van Edek. It says, is there some kind of financial compensation if there is a loss due to wildlife conflict, especially for the farmers?
Yes, there is. In a word, yes. Compensation. I think the government are reviewing the compensation policy at the moment, but certainly any farmer who's lost livestock as a result of loss through predation, by lion or hyena, lion or leopard depredation. Similarly, crop farmers can claim for loss of crops and get compensated through the Department of Wildlife compensation scheme. There are some challenges there with so many applications, and a limit to the budget that can provide compensation to all of the farmers that have applied.
Thanks, Graham. We have just a few minutes for other questions. Richard, do any of your students still have a question?
Okay.
Super.
Yeah, my name is Esa. So my question goes like this. So I've heard Prof mentioning how like the elephants movement depends on the change in seasons. So my question is like, how has climate change influenced the migration and the distribution of the elephants across like the countries that you mentioned? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. Yeah, that is a really good one because it has big implications on elephant distribution and also on the number and severity of conflict. So what we have seen in the past, we can't necessarily say it's climate change. We all know climate change is happening, and it gives rise to, as the scientists say, gives rise to more extreme events. And so what I can say is that from previous extreme events, like really dry, wet seasons, especially back-to-back, very dry, wet seasons, that we have seen a restriction in the extent and the period of distribution of elephants away from permanent water into dry woodlands where normally rainfall would fill up seasonal pans and sustain elephants with that critical resource, water, throughout the wet season. But now, during this extreme drought conditions, those seasonal pans dry up very quickly. It means the elephants have to return to a permanent water source and be closer to the Okavango, which is where people are. People have inhabited areas around the Okavango Delta right next to these permanent water sources also for good reason, because they also need access to the water. They also need access to the resources there, fishing and grass and reeds that they need to build their houses with. So when you have a situation whereby climate change pushes the elephant population more consistently around where people are also coexisting, the likelihood of competition for those resources and negative confrontations increases. And so it does have big implications on, firstly, the extent of the elephant population, and secondly, the overlap between that population and its resource use and that of rural communities living and sharing the same landscape. So yeah, really good question, and we really need to take that into consideration in the years to come and plan for that, because we are definitely going to experience more extreme dry weather events, extreme drought events. So we need to come up with solutions to make it easier in those circumstances.
Thank you, Graham. Graham, it is 11 o'clock on the hour. Can I take one more question from the students if there is one?
Okay, one more question.
Okay, here we go.
Good morning. My name is Patimo, and I know for a fact that there are some policies that are being implemented for balancing elephants as well as development and climate change. I want to know that are there any key challenges that are being faced in implementing policies that consider both elephants conservation and climate change mitigation adaptation? Thank you.
Yeah, good question. You've really got me thinking there. It is a big challenge. You know, and I guess the best way of answering this is, okay, how do we, in terms of policy, how do we make subsistence agriculture more sustainable and more resilient to the impacts of climate change? That, for example, would mean, you know, irrigation schemes that allow farmers to access permanent water sources to irrigate their crops, whether it be to sustain them through the rainy season or to grow crops independent of the rains. In respect to the elephants and elephant management, you know, they will also need more access to these permanent wetlands and the resources they contain. And so how to reconcile the need for access to the wetlands and the resources they provide, the main one being water, you know, and avoid the heightened competition for that resource. And that really comes down to how do we reconcile all of these land use related policies and from all the different sectors. All of the sectors overlap in terms of what they want to do and how we want to develop the different sectors. And the best way of reconciling that really comes down to effective integrated land use planning.
Thanks, Graham. Graham, one little question from my side is just how are women farmers included with a big representation in your community meetings, or are there issues around them not being included or cultural issues? I'm not sure whether that is something that you deal with.
Yes, they are. In fact, probably I would say between 70 and 80% of the farmers that we work with are women farmers, women-led fields. So yeah, it's a really high percentage of women farmer participation, and actually informing syndicates like agricultural cooperatives.
Okay, fantastic, Graham.
They've proven to be really motivated. Yeah.
Super. Graham, I know we need to respect your time limitations, and I know you need to go now. I think that if any of the students or audience have additional questions for Graham, I think we can provide, or I hope, Graham, we can provide your details, your contact information, so that they can personally get a question through to you. Would that be okay?
Yeah, no problem. No problem at all. And I think Richard has my details. If not, then I'm absolutely happy to share them. But yeah, great. And thanks so much again for interacting, and it was a pleasure.
Thank you very much for generously sharing your information, your expertise with us. Thanks, Richard. Sorry, Graham. Thanks,
No
Graham.
problem. Great. Thank you, guys. Thanks a lot.
Thank
Take
you.
care and good luck.